Not that it's my place to speak, but maybe Sophie Lark isn't racist. Maybe she just doesn't care. Not sure that's better though. Oh, I see you found me. Very well. I'll introduce myself properly some other time. Let's dig in. While I don't celebrate Halloween, I do appreciate a good pumpkin and a nice autumn park. It is an understatement. I am embarrassingly obsessed with autumn as much as any other basic millennial. I have a playlist and everything, and I'm pretty sure I've had a pumpkin spice latte at least once this year. And while I don't read really scary books, I, like many, do enjoy some slight October spookiness. That being said, today we're not talking spooky, we're talking scary. A scarily bad case of representation/exploitation of the Ukrainian identity and trauma in a scarily lazy book. A little over a year ago, right in the spooky season, Sophie Lark, the one with the tone-deaf migrant jokes, released a dark romance novel about a Ukrainian woman who had to flee her country in the midst of war. And you know what? If I hadn't known any better, I would have given her the benefit of the doubt. After all, dark romance is supposed to explore dark themes like PTSD, survivor's guilt, that type of thing. Seems fitting, right? Before we delve any deeper, I am a woman who spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I'm not a Ukrainian woman. Although I know quite a few of them, they did not authorize me to speak on their behalf. So I'm here in the role of someone offended for someone else. What's not to love about that? But if you have a problem with my criticism, remember, they didn't authorize you either, and this is all my subjective opinion, sometimes illustrated by facts. Reading is subjective, yada yada, let's move on. So, months and months ago, I was unlucky enough to stumble upon quotes from Sophie's book Monarch that is apparently second in the series, the name of which I would have told you if I cared. That happened after the Ukrainian publisher KSD decided to release Lark's Brutal Prince, which I know it's not fantasy, but I distinctly remember someone on BookTube saying they thought it was, and that made me think they might have mistaken it for The Cruel Prince, which in turn got me thinking about the Asylum studio. That's probably not what Sophie was going for, but I thought the associations that the title caused were funny. At the end of the day, KSD decided not to bring Sophie to the Ukrainian book market. They claimed to have terminated the contracts they had with her and destroyed the books that they had already printed, and soon enough you'll understand why. The credit for the quotes goes to a Threads bookish account, Red Saturn. By the way, that was where I saw them first, for better or worse. So what happened was, when Ukrainian book lovers went snooping, they found out that Sophie Lark not only allegedly called the occupied Crimea Russian and is a fan of the Russian mafia, which, well, we're not here to kink shame, but if we were, I wouldn't judge us for that. No, in the spirit of trying to sit on both chairs, she also released a book about a girl who is so desperate to get out of Ukraine, she's ready to marry a near stranger. So, about a mail order bride, which is so original. My god, Sophie, stop. What are you doing? Your disruption to the genre is so original, never seen before. And because apparently the night air raids aren't making my life miserable enough, I read the entire thing. Part of it I read in an underground parking lot serving as a shelter to maximize my chances to get a heart attack out of sheer annoyance. Didn't work. So let's go over the plot first, I guess. Disclaimer, I'm not the target audience for dark romance, so if I sound judgy, that's because I am, and it's a me problem, not a you problem. I'm not here to offend you, but that still might happen. That being said, I don't discriminate dark romance book by thinking they have some get-out-of-jail-free card for being badly written or just silly. So, Elena, with an E. Keep that name in mind, will ya? Lands in the United States, apparently from her flight from Lviv. Keep that in mind too. And runs straight into the arms of her fiancé Lorne, who is allegedly a thriving horror books author. He checks her in a hotel called Monarch, hence the title, because the house he's building for their life together isn't ready yet. Lorne has a daughter named Ivy who's nonverbal and probably neurodivergent, but we never know her diagnosis, as that would require Sophie to actually research something, and what a ridiculous thought is that. Elena met Lorne during a so-called romance tour in Lviv, where they were both acting like they were better than participating in a thing in which they were both willingly participating, so they bonded over being not like other everyone and got engaged, or something like that. Elena is obsessed with America and has zero problems with leaving her entire life behind. Very typical for Ukrainian women, so that's what you choose. Now, Elena is 27 and a virgin, which is apparently very important because unlike her country of origins, it's in the premise, and you can bet her Prince Charming is immediately and obviously very weird about it. He's also controlling, jealous, secretive, and increasingly creepy. But don't worry, Elena won't think about it twice until the very end, when she won't do anything about it either, because the plot will do everything for her. You see, we're told that Elena is smart, but the plot needs her to be dumb as a rock to happen, so that's what we're getting. Subtlety is hardly the name of the game here, so Lorne writes incredibly creepy and dark books, and Elena even knows how he clearly cares about his villains more than their victims. God, I wish we could suss out the potential creeps among writers in real life that easily too. Anyway, Elena immediately strikes up a friendship with the hotel's owner Atlas, and by friendship I mean he falls for her on the spot and is very normal about it. There is nothing weird about comparing your crush to a wild animal when she eats, or fantasizing about her as she lays right in front of you asleep after being drugged. Don't be silly, that's a completely green flag behavior.
And that's how it's done, folks!
And make no mistake, Elena's appearance is fetishized at every step. We'll get back to that. We also find out that Elena's claustrophobic after the car accidents that killed her parents and left her trapped in the wreckage covered in their blood. Also, she was in quite a hurry to leave Ukraine because she killed a guy who assaulted her in self-defense and left the body in the basement of the bookshop where she was working at the moment. So she needed to get out of the country in case it gets discovered. Apparently, extradition isn't a thing in Sophie Lark's multiverse of cringe, so the moment Lenочka stepped foot on the American soil, she can call a radio station and ask to put on a song for Ukrainian National Police.
You can catch me now.
Probably. I really don't think she was thinking that far. Our girl wastes some of her and our time wandering around and being deliberately dense, and realizes she's actually in love with Atlas. Who would have thought? And Lorne is not that good of a guy and a terrible father. It takes her quite a lot of time, really. And no, I'm not making fun of real women who get trapped in abusive relationships which no one deserves. I am making fun of this book. Kindly do stay focused. Conveniently, Lorne is indeed the worst, so cheating on him is okay. Inconveniently, he kidnaps Elena and locks her up in his house that he's apparently been building as a huge torture chamber for her and his own daughter, cause he's a psycho with 0 layers. Conveniently, Atlas shows up with an axe, Lorne runs away and gets himself killed. Atlas and Elena get married. Court grants her a Ukrainian immigrant who's been in the country for like 5 minutes and whose main reason to come is now dead. Guardianship over Lorne's daughter, who by the way has living relatives because that's a thing that can happen, and they live happily ever after or something. The end.
Oh, how convenient.
Can you tell this was published before November 2024? Because I can. By the way, if you feel like I'm attacking Sophie personally, I'm not even sure Sophie Lark is her real name. My criticism is only linked to the author's persona and the writing she made a choice to put out in the world, and let's be honest, do you see the numbers on this channel? I'm not sure how you got here. There's no chance she'll ever see this. Calm down. Also, I don't know where to put this, so I'll just say it here. So remember I said Elena killed a guy in self-defense, right? So apparently, from how it's described, she left his body in the basement of the bookshop, just left it there for months. Clearly there was no smell, no one ever wondered where the manager of the store went. And then, after the bookstore was sold and she left, she finds out it got demolished, and it's very much implied that it got demolished with everything inside, with all the books and stuff. So does Sophie think that this is how it's done in general, or does she think that this is how it's done in Ukraine? Because apparently there is some procedure, and I'm no lawyer or a construction worker, but it would make sense to inspect the building first, at least get out the goods that can still be sold, like books for example, to reduce the amount of debris you'll have to pay for cleaning up if nothing else. But nope, no, the bookstore, gone. Apparently, no one ever noticed a dead body in the basement. Good for Lenочka, I guess.
Oh, how convenient.
Not to overstate the obvious, but I'm not a fan. Elena has a massive not like other girls vibe. Sophie couldn't think of a better way to give her personality than to say she quote-unquote lives in jeans, but don't you worry, she's effortlessly beautiful and feminine and basically what your average American fantasy of an Eastern European woman looks like. She's also presumably feisty and independent, but also very willing to thrust herself into the arms of the first and second foreigner who shows any interest in her. She's also a huge bookworm, but it's not like that matters for the plot. Loving books isn't a virtue or a sign of intelligence. I love books, and I'm not all that. Also, Elena didn't even finish school. We will come back to that. But somehow she speaks perfect English with an accent, because unlike an accent, grammatical errors can't be fetishized. As I said, she's just obsessed with America, because that's the only country in the world, as we all know. Credit where it's due. Sophie Lark knows that Russia and Ukraine are 2 separate countries, and she or her editor can spell Lviv correctly, but I'm not sure if she knows we don't all speak English occasionally here. When it comes to Ukraine and Ukrainian representation, I'll just go over some of the bits where it's mentioned and share the local perspective, so to speak. My first thought at the mentions of Ukraine in this book was that if it was possible to do a negative amount of research, that would have been my guess of how much Sophie researched this country before she opened her note app or whatever this was written in. Let's start with the protagonist's name, Elena Zelenska, because what in John Rowling is this nonsense? In case you didn't know, Ukraine's first lady's name is Olena Zelenska. Elena isn't really a variant of this name that is common in Ukraine. I don't think I've ever heard it. There's a short name for it, Lena, that some claim as their full name, and the Russian analog is of course Elena. Elena Zelenska sounds like Sophie really couldn't be bothered to search for more Ukrainian names, picked one of the most currently well-known ones and tweaked it just enough to not get a call from these fine gentlemen here. There's another Ukrainian female character mentioned here, and her name is Mina, which is also a very unusual name for a Ukrainian, and I'm saying it while taking into account how original some Ukrainian parents get with naming their kids. I've literally never heard this one. The only named Ukrainian male character mentioned is called Boyka, with an A in the end, which I'm choosing to believe is a last name, and even in that case, the more Ukrainian sounding one would be Boyko, but I guess getting anything right is for weaklings. And here's the thing, Elena's second name, which isn't really a thing in Ukraine, but let's assume it's her full name, that's possible, is Darina, which is a very normal, real Ukrainian name. So Sophie could get it right, she just didn't care to. Next, it's mentioned that Elena lands in the airport that is smaller even than the one in Lviv. Now, granted, Danilo Halitsky International Airport is not super big, true enough. It's also not working at the moment. And hasn't been since February 24, 2022, just like any other civilian airport in Ukraine, which is so easy to find out. Why do you think there were crowds of refugees crossing borders by foot? You think they all had flying anxiety?
Long, arduous journeys, exhausting journeys to get across the border. We've been speaking to people who have been walking mile upon mile, kilometre upon kilometre in order to get to the Polish borders.
It's the smallest detail, but it just shows how little she cares. Oh my god, I need to calm down. Okay, then Sophie keeps making weird generalized comments about Ukrainians that don't even feel like stereotypes, more like she's trying to hit a target while knowing it's a vague direction, only it's in a dark room and she's blindfolded and she's also spun around a few times, all the while she could just take the blindfold off and do her research. Like, here. God, you look incredible. He holds the outsides of my arms, leaning back to look at me. I'm embarrassed even though I spent a lot of time getting ready, hoping to elicit exactly this sort of reaction. It's just that a Ukrainian man would never say it like that for everyone to hear. He probably wouldn't say it at all. He'd just give me a certain kind of smirk. Okay. Sophie, dear, I would be shocked to find out you've ever talked to someone who actually lives in Ukraine. So how do you know that? It's not just some generalization that is potentially most likely incorrect, like, for example, saying all Muslim men hate women, which would be factually incorrect because you can't account for all men in this group and at least some of them don't hate women. It's just incorrect. I heard Ukrainian men compliment women. It's really not a big deal. Maybe Ukrainian women could share some observations about their countrymen, but you didn't speak to many of those, did you, Sophie? No, I don't think you did. There was another tidbit that made me think that the author was just throwing stuff at the wall and not caring for what sticks. Elena mentions how her uncle didn't care about her trauma, saying, "Yeah, well, my uncle wasn't a fan of how many months it took me to get used to sleeping in a bunk bed. I used to wake up and see the slice overhead and start screaming, but I got used to it eventually. Ukrainians are big believers in exposure therapy." I don't know why I'm trying to make her sound British, just rolls it. And this just sounded hollow. Like, she could say the same thing about any other nation. No, really, I think she could. Now, granted, mental health and dealing with trauma weren't super normalized subject in Ukraine until recently, but we know child therapists exist and they are a thing here, and they have been a thing here for a while. So again, I'm not even offended because this is just a stupid, empty statement, made probably because we can't let either of the two Ukrainian men mentioned in this book not sound like a terrible person. Then the Ukrainian Postal Service catches strays for some reason. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'd like to respectfully decline criticism from someone in whose country, allegedly, leaving packages at the doorstep for anyone to grab is considered normal, okay? Ukrposhta, get behind me. And there are many such little remarks that make it glaringly obvious Sophie was allergic to thinking about Ukrainian representation for a fraction of a second longer than she absolutely needed to. Like, Elena wears a Dynamo Kyiv jersey even though she lives in Lviv and there are soccer clubs in Lviv, and even though people here usually don't wear those outside of sports events and such, but whatever, I guess. She almost got 1 point right, though, I'll give her that. In the beginning, Elena observes that she's the only passenger dressed up for traveling by plane. Ukrainians, from what I've seen, did have a tendency to dress up a little for flying, as this was a more fancy way of traveling and wasn't super widespread in the 90s and 2000s. But even then, this wasn't a best dress type of deal. People would just wear something nice while still comfortable. The traveling wardrobe became even more casual once visa-free traveling to the EU and low-cost flights became available fashionable. And how come Elena, who's, I remind you, obsessed with America, doesn't know beforehand that Americans don't dress up to travel? Girl, simping for that country is your entire personality in this book. Do your research. When it comes to Elena's appearance, I'll just describe it, then I'll voice my bad faith opinion, and you decide for yourself, okay? So she's a tall blonde with blue eyes and pale skin and is at least once compared to Snow Queen. Now, there are definitely Ukrainian women who look like that, but the thing is, in general, on average, Ukrainians, even blue-eyed blondes, tend to have a bit warmer complexion. Like in 9 cases out of 10, Snow Queen isn't the first association that'll come to your mind. Ukrainian folklore and classical literature often mention dark eyes and dark eyebrows as a symbol of female beauty. There is nothing particularly wrong with making a Ukrainian woman a pale blonde because, again, it's not impossible. And Atlas, by the way, compares Elena to a Viking queen, which is warmer. I'd say I know a Ukrainian girl or two I'd compare to a Viking queen. That's possible. I'll give you that. But then there is this interesting little tidbit where Elena's quote-unquote Siberian cheekbones get mentioned. And, okay... Here are some indigenous women of Siberia, from the nations that have been there from before it was colonized by Russia. As you can see, indeed, beautiful cheekbones. But A, this is not what most women in Ukraine, namely in Lviv, look like. B, I bet that's not what Sophie Lark had in mind. Not at all, no. In fact, I think she was going for something like this. Yes, this is a Russian model. My bad faith assessment is that Sophie Lark is describing a typical Russian top model. There. I said it. I don't think she cared to look up what Ukrainian women look like, and again, the way her love interest describes her makes her sound like an object, which is telling. Let's talk about language. Again, to be fair to Sophie, there are some Ukrainian words in this book, by which I mean not all of what she puts in italic sounds like some weird attempt to reinvent Russian, but some of it did, like this weird creature. Honestly, she can't even getting it wrong right. For context, the Lviv region is predominantly Ukrainian-speaking. It also, like other parts of Ukraine, has its own local vernacularisms. And while I don't expect an American author to have full grasp of local dialects that I don't even know all that well, it would be really nice if a girl whose first language is Ukrainian didn't use a Russian name for pancakes. The Ukrainian word is olatki, and by the way, we use the word pancake to remember the right word isn't the achievement it's presented to be here. So again, aggressive lack of caring, which is bizarre considering how easy this would be to get right. Like, you can't tell me this isn't just quote-unquote goddamn put into Google Translate and then straight into the manuscript without checking it with the native speaker. By the way, let's talk about Lviv, shall we? While most of the times Sophie tries to convince us she could find Ukraine on a map with a gun at her head are just eye-roll inducing, some made me genuinely angry, like this one. Sometimes Greenstone is even more depressing than Lviv. My notes in my reading app just said, shut up. Because yes, there is nothing more depressing than Lviv, especially Lviv in the autumn. Don't you just hate the idea of an old European city with all those disgusting narrow cobbled streets and all this historic architecture and golden leaves falling in parks and this crispy air in the morning? Ugh. Honestly, the most depressing thing about Lviv in October is that I'm not there right now. She makes a point of highlighting the difference in the air because apparently Lviv smells like, and I quote, diesel and that fried scent from home, end of quote. Lenочka is so well spoken. Can you tell she reads a lot? For the unfortunates who haven't been, Lviv's downtown smells like coffee. In the autumn, it smells like coffee and fallen leaves. The city was among the pioneers of pedestrian zones in Ukraine, so again, the air quality commentary is based on nothing. I assume Sophie thinks Lviv and Zaporizhia look the same, but they in fact do not. If I were in a more grace-giving mood, I'd assume the diesel bit refers to diesel generations that are widely used by shops and cafes during energy outages, like the one during which I was writing the script, by the way, sitting in a coffee shop with candles, listening to a generator rambling outside. But she never clarifies it, and I have no reason to assume it. In another place, she decided to tell us how dreadful the Lviv weather is because apparently it's directly influenced by Siberia, which, no, it's an Eastern European city. The weather is actually usually milder than in Kiev. Sophie, darling, what are you talking about? Summer is the rainy season kind of implies that there is no sun in Lviv, which is very funny. Look, I understand that coming to the country at war might be scary and generally traveling isn't accessible to everyone equally, but Google is free. In other words, leave that city out of your mouth if you can't honor it properly, Sophie. If you wanted a story about Siberia, you should have written about it. Another thing that almost broke me, to drive home just how much Elena's life sucked in that terrible land called Ukraine. The book mentions she dropped out of school at 15, which annoyed me so much. I posted about it back in the spring and it started an entire discussion in which I found out that it's not entirely impossible in Ukraine. So I'm not saying this doesn't happen, but secondary education, 10 or 11 years of secondary school or 9 years there in trade school, is mandatory in Ukraine by law. I couldn't find any practical mechanism of enforcing it, but she was already orphaned and it's never addressed how her legal guardian not provided her with her constitutional right to education while living in a city, not in some rural nowhere off the grid, didn't result in anything like removing her from their custody. This would be a failure of the system, fair and square. Can't believe Sophie passed on the opportunity to dunk on this country some more. At the risk of generalizing, from my experience, it's pretty hard to drop out of school in Ukraine for poor grades or poor attendance. Your grades might be terrible and you might still graduate, maybe with no chances to get into a university, but still. Generally, dropping out of school to help her uncle and aunt with work sounds just so aggressively American to me. At 15, she'd have at most another couple years to finish her school, which makes it a near nonsensical decision on her and her guardian's part. At the very least, she could have said she finished the 9th grade but didn't complete her school education, and that would make more sense for a Ukrainian person. Otherwise, it just makes me think about that Riverdale scene.
I dropped out in the 4th grade to run drugs to support my nana.
Yeah, that one. And it's a small thing, by far not the most egregious, but it just got under my skin and I couldn't get why. After some thinking, I guess the reason is that while Elena's brief rendezvous with academia ended more than 10 years prior to the events of the book, at the time when it was written and the story takes place, thousands of Ukrainian children cannot study in a normal, safe environment because they've been kidnapped by Russia, or they live in the occupied regions, or they can't attend school in person because there are no shelters, or they were killed. And this background just highlights once more how much Sophie Lark can't be bothered to put in some effort into her own story, which leads us to none. And I mean none of Elena's trauma is linked to the war. This book came out in October 2024, and I understand that it had probably already been finished for a while before that. But in September 2024, Russia attacked Lviv with missiles, killing 7 people, including a mother with her 3 daughters, and injuring over 60 more. It's hard for me not to think about this when I see how devoid a POV of a Lvivian character is of this reality. It is brought up like once, mainly to basically insult this entire nation. In Ukraine, there is no stigma against marrying a foreigner. If anything, it's celebrated, especially since the war started. Anything to get out, even for those of us who live on the west side of the country, farthest from the fighting. Now, if some other statements just don't make sense, this is just a lie. I don't have my own experience to speak on the matter. I asked around, and adding that to my previous observations, some Ukrainians do have a very vocal prejudice against Ukrainian women marrying foreigners. This is not right, but this is the reality, and I don't think we're extremely special in that regard, to be honest. What I have never observed, and I genuinely don't think it's a widespread sentiment, is celebrating marrying a foreigner. People can make jokes about it, they can be supportive of their relatives' personal choices, but there is no consensus that this is a good thing. No, Sophie, marrying one of your countrymen isn't the pinnacle of success for an average Ukrainian girl. This isn't what most women here dream about. And to get out of Ukraine for women here, it's more or less enough to cross the border and start a new life as a refugee. It is very hard, harder than I make it sound, but it would be the fastest way to physically get out of the country. But what's the fastest way here? Of course, to join the bride market. Not board a bus, get to Poland and apply for the EU protection. No. We don't even consider that this woman could find a job or start learning something to be able to apply for a job and start contributing to her new community, like many Ukrainian women who traveled abroad did. Her only way out that is even entertained is a passport bro. And she never looks back at this strategy as something she probably should have thought twice about, even when it almost gets her killed. My guess is we'll never interrogate why Elena can't just officially become a refugee, because refugee is such a depressing word, isn't it? It's only mentioned once in the book in a very derogatory way. We clearly don't want to think about all that sad stuff. I swear, had Sophie Lark felt she could get away with not mentioning the Russian war against Ukraine at all, she would have. And of course, she never calls it Russian war, it's just war, something vague and almost harmless. It's so inconsequential, in fact, that she had to give Elena a whole different reason to flee. Or rather, it's so sensitive and uncomfortable that she cannot make it the main reason. It might look like a more tactful choice, but I tend to call it a cowardly one. And of course, in the world of Sophie Lark, leaving your home behind forever is barely an inconvenience. Trauma of knowing an entire neighboring state wants you and your loved ones dead, homesickness, struggle to adjust to a new reality? We don't know them. The nonchalance of this statement, anything to get out, basically brushes off thousands of Ukrainian women who had to make a heartbreaking choice to uproot their entire lives and build it from scratch in a new place that isn't even guaranteed to be safe, as well as thousands of Ukrainian women who stayed behind to keep living and working and having and raising children under the risk of losing it all in a blink of an eye, let alone thousands of those who volunteered to fight, thousands of those killed in action or in their own homes. In the universe of this book, Ukraine is a white room and the women in it are invisible unless they're willing to do anything to get out.
Why don't you leave?
Because this is my home and nobody can tell me that I have to go from my home.
Elena doesn't ever reflect the impossibility and burden of that choice because Sophie Lark never thinks about it because she doesn't care. In fact, for Elena, the war itself seems to have barely existed. Yeah, that thing that has been hovering over us, keeping us awake at night, taking away our cities and our loved ones, and threatening to take away our state, Lenочka hardly noticed it. She's too busy trying to marry a foreigner, which is basically her main goal in life at this point, and when the first foreigner turns out to be a first-mate parade of red flags, she readily switches to the next one without having to think twice about her life decisions. Remember, anything to get out. Lviv and the Lviv region have been under Russian fire more or less since the beginning of the full-scale invasion in 2022, even if it's nowhere near as constant and brutal as it is in the eastern, southern, and northern regions closer to the front line, or as regular as it is in Kyiv. In April 2022, for example, a missile strike hit Lviv, killing 7 people and injuring 11. During the fall and winter of 2022-2023 and in periods after, Lviv, like the rest of Ukraine, suffered from power outages. Thousands of people moved west that couldn't have not affected the region center. But we never see Elena reminiscing about those people who walked the same streets with her and are now dead, or about how she would get triggered hearing an air raid siren back at home, or how she got so used to energy outage periods she's kinda out of habit of having electricity all the time. I know I was. In the spring of 2023, it felt really new being able to heat up food 24/7. Not to see any of this mentioned anywhere in the book, or in the author's note, or in the author's communication about this book that can be traced down through search, it feels uncanny, but also very deliberate. I'm almost ready to assume Sophie Lark doesn't know that the war isn't contained to the eastern regions of the country. I don't think she knows about massive airstrikes on civilian targets. I don't think she's heard about drones and missiles that hit towns and villages hundreds of kilometers away from the front line. I'm not saying that this is the case, I'm just saying this book wouldn't disprove that it is. And I'm not pretending like one can understand war without living in it. For the record, I don't consider myself the one living in a war zone. And also for the record, I don't think only a person of a certain identity can write a character with this identity. But if you're in this position, it takes a lot of research and a lot of humility, and I see none of that here. What I see is willful ignorance and banking on a nation's tragedy without a due respect or even acknowledgement. And together with Sophie Lark's other writing choices, that drives me to the conclusion that she couldn't risk ruffling the feathers of her Russian mafia-loving audience, and I can imagine why she thought she'd get away with it. In fact, she kind of did. Let's face it, this slop has 3.85 on Goodreads, which is far more than it deserves, so most of her readers clearly don't care. And again, no judgment, but if you consider yourself a person who sees the difference between right and wrong, caring seems like a logical option. Again, let me just reiterate, because I really want to be understood correctly here. Monarch is a terrible, lazy, harmful, and tone-deaf case of Ukrainian representation, not because Elena is broke, or because she's marrying an American, or even because she's a so-called male bride. It's because her Ukrainian identity is a token, and the war that reshaped the lives of millions of Ukrainian people has no tangible effect on her whatsoever. Sophie Lark made a choice to write and publish a book about a Ukrainian woman during this war without having the guts to acknowledge it. This is shameless monetization of the crime of war of aggression that is killing people daily with no end in sight. And before anyone goes, it's dark romance, it's not literary fiction, it ain't that deep, you can save your time. If one deems appropriate to monetize the war that had entire cities razed to the ground, entire family lines eliminated, the war that killed people I knew, made me leave my city more than once and probably will again, and drags me out of my bed into a bomb shelter every now and then, I reserve the right to rip into your book if it's bad. And this book is bad. The suffering of the less privileged nations of the world doesn't exist to fuel your art. You're not narrow, and we're no Rome burning to inspire you. Don't talk about us like we're not in the same room. Either do your homework or leave us out of it. I wanted to include my thoughts on Handling by Maria Reva since it uses the same theme of marriage industry in Ukraine, but in a very different, much more self-aware and interesting way. But I'm still listening to it, and this audio is already getting so long, I'll probably just talk about it in my wrap-up later. So if you're still here, thank you. Stay tuned, and in the meantime, enjoy reading better books than this one. Bye. But by the way, as I was researching for this video, I noticed someone wrote a Ukrainian Wikipedia page for Sophie Lark, calling her a Russian mafia popularizer. So congrats, Sophie. I suggest you put this on your business card.